Hey guys, what we've got here today is some chapter 4 notes. So in your chapter 4 packet, I'm kind of going to flip around a little bit here, but I'm at the bottom of page 8. So flip to your packet, look for the picture of the tomatoes up here. And we're going to talk first of all about an experiment that's taking place on growing tomatoes. So if any of you guys have ever tried to grow any plants, any fruits, any flowers, whatever, you know that there's a lot of factors that go into how well they grow. And in this case, this guy is trying to figure out how to increase his, supply of tomatoes. And so we've got some details here about how he's going to do his experiment. And so he's wondering, first of all, if the amount of fertilizer affects the tomato plants. Obviously, it probably does. Otherwise, fertilizer wouldn't exist. And then also, what about the amount of water given to the plants? And so he wants to test both of these variables on his tomato production. And then in detail, he's explaining what he's going to go through here. He's going to have 24 tomato plants in identical pots in his greenhouse. And so you know that identical pots, meaning they all have enough space to grow. They're all in the greenhouse, meaning that like some aren't inside and some aren't outside. He's trying to control a big part of this experiment by doing similar tomato plants, identical pots in his greenhouse. And what he's going to do is he's going to add fertilizer to half of them. So half are going to be fertilized and half aren't. But then he also has to split those up. So now we're at groups of 12 tomato plants, 12 with fertilizer, 12 without. And what he's going to do is take 8 of the plants, 4 and 4. So 4 with fertilizer and 4 without. And he's going to give them a half a gallon. 8 plants are going to have 1 gallon. And the remaining 8 plants are going to have 1.5 gallons of water. And he's going to do this for 3 months. He's going to record the total weight of the tomatoes produced on each plant. And that's how he's going to decide what's the best combo of fertilizer and water. So that was a lot of details, but all those details are very important in implementing this experiment. So we're going to first identify the explanatory and response variables, as you can tell, and list all the treatments. Okay, so I have written out what the explanatory and response variables are, what explains the weight of the tomatoes, and in this case there are 2 explanatory variables. One of which is the fertilizer, and the other of which is the amount of water. It's okay to have 2 explanatory variables. It just makes for a more complicated procedure. And then the response is, what is he doing at the end to measure his success? He's weighing his tomatoes. So the weight of the tomatoes is the response. In terms of the treatments, there are several of them, and I kind of wrote them out here. And so you can see that they are divided into groups of 4. And so kind of there are 2 fertilizer treatments, either fertilizer or no fertilizer. And there are 3 different water treatments, which 2 times 3 gives us 6 total treatment options. And I listed them out here. So there are 4 plants that receive fertilizer and a half a gallon of water. There are 4 plants that receive no fertilizer with a half gallon of water. And then 4 with fertilizer and 1 gallon, no fertilizer 1 gallon, fertilizer 1.5 gallons, no fertilizer 1.5 gallons. So that gives us our 6 different treatment options for all of these 24 plants, taking into account whether or not they receive fertilizer and how much water they got. So now in terms of lurking variables, what we have to think about is, okay, besides fertilizer and amount of water, what else could be playing into how much these plants are growing and the weight of the tomatoes and how productive this guy's being? So here's where you're kind of open-ended a little bit, and there are a lot of correct answers, but you got to think to yourself, what are some lurking variables that could be impacting this experiment? So what I've done is I've listed a couple things, and maybe you thought of some other things that I didn't, but light exposure, and I guess I'm trying to picture this greenhouse with all these identical pots of tomatoes. Maybe the ones like near the edge of the greenhouse versus the ones that are in the center of the greenhouse are getting more light. Maybe the soil quality, although he did specify that he's using identical pots, maybe he got like a batch of soil that might, not be as good as a different batch, whatever. Maybe again, in different spots in the greenhouse, the temperature is variable. Maybe he had a couple different packets of seeds and one of the packets was bad. I'm not sure, I'm just kind of brainstorming here. Even though he did say similar tomato plants, we're not exactly sure, and these are just potential other variables that could be lurking, and lurking meaning playing into our experiment here. And so what I'm going to do now is we're going to move on to these 3 words that you read about here. these words here are very important. These three. This is a big test topic on your chapter 4 test that you're going to see in class. These three words are very, very important and used in many different ways. So these are called the 3 principles of experimental design: control, randomization, and replication. And all 3 of them are impacting our experiment that we're doing with these tomatoes. So what we have here, the first one is control. Basically, you're explaining using some really good statistical lingo, as I've modeled here, what are you controlling in this experiment? And so the reason why you control, and this is going to be a really important topic and something that's going to come up, the reason you control is because you're controlling the effects of lurking variables. And that's why this whole thing called control is implemented into any experiment. So you're controlling the effects of lurking variables, and we're doing that by, we're doing our best to control all of these things up here that I listed. Remember how I kept saying, now I know he said this, and I know that it does say this in the problem. We are controlling this stuff by keeping plants in identical pots in the same greenhouse. Treatments are then imposed. What are you controlling about the experiment? You are forcing these plants to either have fertilizer or not, and have a certain amount of water. And then we're comparing the weights in order to decide what was the best treatment. And we did have 6 total treatment options: 2 times 3, 2 options of fertilizer times 3 water amounts. Those are listed up here. So this randomization principle, how was that implemented into this? How did we use randomization in this experiment? We're randomly assigning the plants to the treatments to balance the effects of the lurking variables on the response variable. So like definition, your lingo that you're using, the reason we did this is so that we can balance the effects of the lurking variables on the response variable, and because it ensures homogeneity of treatment groups. So I have kind of an example written out here. If we didn't have randomization present in this experiment, what could have happened, and there's a lot of other things that could have happened. Here's just one example, but if we didn't randomly assign our little tomato plant seeds to the different treatment groups, they all, in treatment option number 1, which whatever I listed above was, I think it was, let's see, with fertilizer and a half a gallon of water, just for example, all of those plants maybe could have been from the same seed pouch, maybe, and maybe that one specific pouch had a defect in it, which would have caused us to think that fertilizer and a half a gallon of water is the worst possible combination, when actually it was a lurking variable affecting our data. And it was a bad seed pouch. So that's why you randomly assign stuff, is because what it does is it balances the effects of the lurking variables like we have here, and it ensures that each of our treatment groups are the same, meaning that they are going to display the same effects once we impose our treatments. Okay, and so now for our last principle, it's replication. So why do you do an experiment on like more than one plant versus just trying it with one plant? The answers there are pretty obvious, but because we use 24 plants and our 6 different treatment group options that I listed above, that means that we had 4 plants per treatment, and 4 is much better than 1, and obviously more is always better so that you can make a better evaluation. But your lingo that you're going to want to mention here is when you are replicating, what's happening here is we are reducing the influence of random variation on the responses. So for example, what could happen here if we only looked at one tomato plant is that maybe that one tomato plant was a dud, and that would cause us to think that our treatment was bad, even though it had nothing to do with it. So that's why we replicate, so that we make sure that in the case of getting a dud, it wouldn't affect all of the tomato plants. We want to be able to make a better evaluation and looking at the growth of more than one in order to be able to decide what was the best treatment. Okay, now I'm going to have you flip a couple pages to the cell phone example. It's actually right before the 4.3 reading guide, so just flip forwards a couple pages. And what we have now is I'm going to show you how to actually design an experiment and lay it all out. What we have here is a cell phone company, which is interesting, and they're trying to consider one of two different keyboard designs, A versus B. So not even sure if you guys even remember, but my very first smartphone was a BlackBerry. It looked like this, and it had that kind of a keyboard with actual buttons. And then versus like an iPhone or whatever kind of phone you have now probably doesn't have actual buttons on it. Let's pretend like those are our two keyboard designs. And they want us to conduct an experiment. They are calling you, the person with experience in AP statistics, to design a well-designed experiment in which subjects are asked to text several different messages in 5 minutes. So that's how you're going to determine which keyboard is better. The response variable is the number of correctly typed words. And it says you have 40 people that are willing to do this design, incorporate block design, and consider lurking variables. So I think like the hardest part about this scenario is that we are being asked to incorporate block design, which means we need to divide our subjects, our 40 people, into at least 2 groups based on some sort of a similarity that we think might play into how fast they text. So I'm trying to think about how would I block, meaning how would I group people together, like if you're a girl, go over here, and if you're a boy, go over here. But I'm not sure girl versus boy is going to give us a good gauge in terms of texting. I'm not sure there's any similarities or differences between girls and guys. So try and think of something else. My brain is now moving on to my mother-in-law, who has a flip phone, who is probably the slowest texter I've ever seen in my life, versus probably one of you guys that can text probably 50 different text messages per second. And so maybe what I'm going to do is, for my block design, what I'm going to do is divide my subjects into frequent versus less frequent texters so that I can fairly test the keyboards. I think that's the way I'm going to take this one. There's other options in order to block and to separate, but that's kind of the first thing that I'm thinking of that I think might work. So here's what this thing's going to look like so far. The reason why I blocked into frequent and less frequent texters is that I wouldn't want to have a bunch of really old people like my mother-in-law who don't know how to text in one group, therefore making me think one keyboard is worse than the other. So that's kind of what you have to think about when you're blocking. So I want to divide them into 20 frequent texters, like high school kids maybe, and 20 less frequent texters, like grandparents, older people, people with flip phones, people without technology, whatever. And so I've started to show like this tree that I'm going to draw out in order to incorporate my design. And so what I've done here is I have my 40 subjects, I divided them into 20 and 20, and I'm labeling them how I'm dividing them. And I'm mentioning here that this is blocking that I'm using in order to divide them first of all. Next thing it asked me to do is fully explain the randomization process. So now that I have them divided into 2 groups, what am I going to do now? So now here's what we got. Our tree just grew a little bit more. What I did with my 20 frequent texters is I randomly assigned half of them to use keyboard A and half of them to use keyboard B, because I want to be able to determine within my frequent texters how many of them were faster with A versus B and vice versa. And I did the same thing for my 20 less frequent texters. So I've divided half of them, 10 in for group number 3, 10 into group number 4. So now you can see I have 4 different groups that I'm all testing. And group number 1 gets treatment number 1. We only have 2 treatments here, keyboard A versus keyboard B. Those are the 2 things that we're testing. And so group number 2 gets keyboard B. And then group number 3 gets A, and group number 4 gets B. And so here's what the design is going to look like. And in this case, I am randomly assigning them. I'm not saying like girls go over here, boys go over there, because I want to have randomization present for the reason that we discussed with the tomatoes. And so now how do I finish my tree? Well, what am I doing after I impose these treatments on these groups? I'm comparing number of correct words, and that's how I'm going to decide which is the best keyboard. And so here's how my tree ends. What I'm doing first is I am comparing within my frequent texters, keyboard A versus keyboard B. And I'm going to come up with a judgment based on just the frequent texters. Which keyboard do I think is best and why? I'm going to do the same thing with the people that suck at texting. Treatment 1 versus treatment 2, how many of them think that keyboard A is better? How many of them did better with keyboard B, whatever. And then what I'm going to do is compare both of those results that I came up with amongst all groups, and that is going to be how I'm going to answer the cell phones company's question of which keyboard should we implement. So this is what the actual tree looks like. This is how you lay everything out in terms of how are you going to do your experiment. But of course, there needs to be words that go with in order to describe to someone exactly what's happening in this process. And so what I've written out first is, why did I decide to block the way that I did? That's the first thing that's mentioned here in this tree, and that needs to be explained. Why did I choose frequent versus less frequent texters? And again, there's other ways that I could have blocked for this design just based on what you think about, but I'm going to block on how frequently subjects text. That's the way that I decided to take my design. And how did I decide how to group them? I just put based on a survey given prior to the experiment. I don't know, I shouldn't judge a book by the cover because maybe there are some old people that can text really fast. So based on some sort of a survey, that part is a little bit kind of up in the air. We suspect more frequent texters may be faster, better, more accurate than less frequent texters. So this is the reason why I blocked the way that I did. What am I suspecting, and what am I trying to avoid impacting my data? Okay, so what happens next in my experiment? I have to explain the randomization process. And so this part's really important, but again, you can see up here in the tree, we have random assignment after I've blocked them into their groups. And within each block of 20 subjects, you will not get credit if you just say randomly assign them to treatment groups. You have to explain what that looks like. And the best way to explain that is to picture your 20 people in a classroom. How are you going to randomly assign 10 of them into one group and 10 of them into another group? You need to be really clear and specific. So what I've written here is within each block of 20 subjects, each subject is given a number 1 through 20, and I'm going to use my calculator or a random number generator to generate 10 unique numbers, aka half of them, to receive treatment number 1, which is what again? Keyboard A. And the remaining 10, the other 10 people whose numbers were not called, will receive treatment number 2, which is keyboard B. And just make sure that you have this unique word, which is very important. We've discussed in class why it's important to have unique numbers, because you know random number generators will repeat numbers sometimes, and sometimes that's okay when you're doing an experiment, and other times it's not. In this case, if we repeat somebody's number and we call somebody twice, they've already received their treatment, and that's going to mean we only end up with 9 people and not 10. So these numbers do need to be unique. Another way to say that is that you can skip repeats. But that unique word is going to be very important in your explanation. And so kind of a conclusion just to wrap up, what are we doing at the end of this experiment? We blocked them, then we randomly assigned them. What are we doing once we have done that and we've given our treatments to all of our individuals? So following the treatment, what are we actually looking at? We're comparing number of correctly typed words. Sorry about the bell. We are following treatment. We're comparing number of correctly typed words among all groups. And so that, you guys, is what designing an experiment is actually going to look like. You have some sort of a design up here where it's clear in terms of like a tree or a diagram of some sort. How are you dividing your people up? Why are you doing it that way? How is the randomization implemented? And what are you doing to finalize your treatments and your conclusions? So that is all. Please bring your questions to class. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.